Hello, welcome to my latest mapping tips and tricks video where I will be going over how to control the speed of the player. So obviously in Trackmania you want to go fast as possible. However, that doesn't mean that you're going to be reaching the top speed of the car in every map. Not every map is full speed, and a lot of maps don't even use the highest gear. When mapping, it can be difficult to come up with ways to control the speed of the player, as some maps become awkward to drive when players feel that they're too fast. And the goal of maps shouldn't be to punish fast players, but to make it challenging to reach those speeds in the first place. So I thought I'd share what I learned, partially through what I've seen other people do, and also partially what I have tried in the past. Some worked, some didn't work. And I think one thing to remember is that these aren't hard rules. So a lot of what I'll be saying are mainly just tips, and it's okay to go away from these tips. You know, they aren't hard rules. There's always going to be exceptions that are done well. But especially if you're just building your first few maps, I would at least recommend staying with these tips, understanding why they're there in the first place, and then once you understand why, then you can look at situations where they might not apply. But whether or not these tips apply, speed control is very important to keep in mind, and a large portion of that, one thing I'm going to be continuously referencing throughout this entire video, is a very important mechanic that's tied to speed, and that is gears. So if you've been playing Trackmania for a while, you will know what gears are, but if you are new, then as the car gets faster and slower, once you pass a certain threshold, the car shifts to a new gear. If you're going faster, it shifts up, and then if you're going slower, it shifts down. And it's really important to get these gear ups or downs cleanly, as it helps the car go faster. If the car doesn't have grip while it's attempting to gear up, then the gearing itself will take longer, and that's important because the car doesn't accelerate while changing gears. There isn't really a visual way inside of the game itself to tell if you got to gear up cleanly, but there is an audio cue, and a clean gear should sound like this. Whereas a bad gear sounds like this. And as you can tell with the bad gear, the sound is spread across a greater time. It takes quite a while longer for the car to actually shift into the new gear, and that's a bunch of time that you aren't spent accelerating. So that's why it's very important to get those gear ups cleanly. And it is something that you do have to calculate into your maps. It's considered sloppy mapping if players are forced to slide while changing gears, or forced to take a very awkward line to keep their current gear, since the objective of the map is now focused on making the best of a bad situation instead of taking advantage of the route itself. Now, that being said, gearing up and down intentionally isn't bad, but when it's done constantly, like if you're constantly flipping between 4th and 5th gear, it turns out to be pretty annoying. So I would recommend to try to keep your gear changes to a minimum. And this is something that I notice, especially when new players start mapping. They don't pay attention to gears at all, and this is part of the reason. This is going to be the main point of the video, but to go off on a little bit of a tangent, this is part of the reason why ice is so punishing to new players. Is I want to say every ice slide, but it might not be. So most of the time when you slide out on ice, it's going to be because of gears. Either you geared up or you geared down. And so if you don't understand gears, then that's part of the reason why ice is so frustrating for newer players. So if you do want to be a better driver, not just on ice, but on every single surface, then you do have to start paying attention to gears. So I'd recommend, if you aren't already, start paying attention to them. Good gear management is expected to be built into the map. And don't get me wrong, getting those clean gears can be part of the challenge for a map, but the line has to be there. And generally speaking, the player shouldn't feel like they're fighting the map itself to get those clean gears. But that's kind of my introductory course to gears. If you want more information, I'll try to remember to post a link or two in the description down to some videos if you want to learn more about that. But that was kind of just a crash course in gears, just so when I reference them in the video, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But to start the actual discussion about controlling the speed of the player, I'm going to start with the easiest one, and that is speeding up. So most commonly found in the start of a map and also at double respawns at checkpoints. This is used when you want the player to go faster. Also a mainstay of full speed tracks. There are mainly a couple ways to go about this. I've split it up into two groups, and the first group I'm going to talk about is the immediate speed ups, and these are larger downhills, turbos, and reactors. So this is for getting the player to a high speed very quickly. So if you want a very fast map and you don't want the player to spend 10 plus seconds getting to that speed, then these are some really good options. I will say if you are using reactors, just be careful that you aren't enabling accidental cuts in your tracks. I mean, just take a look at some of the world records for the current campaign, well, winter 2023 as of recording this video, but I'm sure it'll I'm sure it'll apply to whatever campaign is going right now. Reactors enable some pretty insane cuts, so if you are using them, be careful. Because these options gain a lot of speed very quickly, it's also useful for leveling the playing field, especially for double respawns, as if a player crashes, then these blocks let the player catch back up to speed very quickly. You don't want to do this too much, as you don't want mistakes to go unpunished, or you don't want to enable shortcuts, but they are very useful, especially for faster tracks and just immediately getting back up to speed. If you're just speeding up to a lower gear, or speed isn't the main concern of the track, then I would recommend going with a gradual speed up. These include straight lines, turns that don't require the player to drift or release, and smaller downhills. When I say I recommend straight lines, I actually wanted to bring them up to say don't use straight lines, as they're just boring. At least I don't find just holding down the gas and heading in one direction very exciting. So as the term gradual implies, using these techniques, it takes longer for the player to get the speed, and some of the advantages that this can bring is that this is actually useful for showing skill in getting those gear ups cleanly. And if you can maintain that speed, do a good job with maybe some of the early obstacles of the track, and you can get a gear up early, then that lets you get more speed earlier than some of the other players. And gradual speed ups can actually be really good for showing your skill on the track. So when it comes to speeding up, nearly every map needs at least some form of this. And if you've already built a few maps, then I mean, you've probably just done this without thinking about it. But it is important to think about, because if you can make that conscious decision on what the map needs, then that can help make the track more exciting, more skillful, whatever you're going for. Just don't go overboard on the turbo boosters on those double respawns. You can end up having a negative effect where mistakes go unpunished, or enabling some cuts that you didn't want there to be. And if you're going for some more gradual speed ups, make sure the gear ups are clean, because you aren't instantly hitting them on turbos or reactors, but also make sure they aren't boring. Stay away from those straight lines, and make sure that the player is doing something while gaining that speed. Now, as I said before, this is the easiest to map because gaining speed is easy. The hard part is slowing down the player. And this is a tricky topic just because gear downs are generally considered bad. Once you hit a gear, you don't want to head into a lower gear, because that means your car is going to get less speed, and if you have to gear back up, then that's just a bunch of speed loss that's happening. So if you want to avoid it, you probably should. However, gear downs are not inherently bad, and they can be good as long as it's intentional. If you do decide to slow the player down and make it a gear down, you want to make sure that you stay in that lower gear for a while. Don't have it where they just gear down for one turn and then they're immediately back to where they were. Because that's just, it just, honestly, it just seems kind of pointless and it can be kind of annoying. And then players will then go out of their way to look for places to keep that gear, which can lead to some frustrating play patterns, which brings me to my next point of if you are doing a gear down, make sure that there is no way for players to maintain their current gear. Force them into that lower gear. Because if there is a way to maintain that current gear, players are going to go for it because that is going to equal more speed in the long run. And that can make your track more challenging, but it could make your track more challenging in ways that you did not intend, or just make your map super annoying to drive. Especially if the gear up or gear down is a little reliant on RNG, then it's probably not a good thing. So I know I've been dunking on gear downs a little bit, but they can be used well. There's just a couple pitfalls you got to be careful of. But if you are going for that gear down, there are a few different ways to go about it. And the first one, the easiest one to do, is I call it just a brute force slowdown. And these are going to be penalty surfaces and anti-turbo. Anti-turbo boost being turbos in the opposite direction. So the arrows are facing you instead of pointing in the direction that you're going. These work, but they're seen as kind of cheap and lazy. As there's no skill expression involved, it's just someone forcing you to slam on the brakes, and it just kind of feels bad to drive. Penalty surfaces also have kind of a weird mechanic not a lot of people know about, where if you land on a penalty surface, if you land smoothly, then you actually slow down a lot more. In order to avoid slowing down as much on a penalty surface, you want to try to be on 1 or 2 wheels as much as possible, as this reduces your contact with that penalty surface and you'll get punished less for it. But if you're relying on a bad landing from a jump to maintain speed, that can lead to some frustrating play patterns. So at least in the beginning, I would recommend not using these. And also with anti-turbos, when those arrows are facing you, if you drive across them backwards, you won't get a speed penalty. You won't slow down. So it can also kind of give the wrong message to people driving them that you want them to drive backwards. Which, I mean, if that's your intention, then sure, go for it. But if that's not your intention, then it'd be really weird if backwards ended up actually being faster. But if they seem finicky or I'm complaining about them a lot, they really aren't the best options for slowing down the player. Instead, there's a couple different options, and the first one I would like to go over is a way to reward speed, and that is with engine off blocks and steep uphills. And the reason why these are good for rewarding speed is that if you have more speed heading into an engine off block or a steep uphill, that means that you'll be going faster and you'll get through that section more quickly. That seems self-explanatory, but as you move through these sections more quickly, you'll end up losing less speed. And if you want to combine these into an engine off uphill section, then you'll lose speed very quickly. Just be careful about those double respawns if it's near a checkpoint, especially if you're going for track of the day. If these sections go on for long enough, then the car will lose enough speed that when you get to the top of the uphill or get to the end of the engine off, then the car will be in a lower gear than what it started with, and you have successfully slowed down the player. Just make sure it's a little more interesting than just driving without the engine or up a hill. Try to put in some obstacles, maybe some twists and turns, just keep things interesting, It harkens back to the straight lines aren't very fun. So just keep these in mind, and these work really well for rewarding players who have kept up their speed during earlier sections of the track. And the last way I'm going to talk about slowing down players, I've labeled as a skill check, and that is drifting. So gearing down while in a slide can be a very bad thing, because not only are you losing speed from gearing down, but as we've discussed earlier, you're gearing down in a slide, so you don't have grip and that gear down is going to take longer. However, purposeful gear downs while in a drift are fine, because if everyone has to do it, then no one's really losing speed. as well as the penalty for gearing down while sliding isn't as bad on road or platform. However, if you are going for a drift, be extra careful that you cannot keep that gear. No matter which line you go from, you will gear down. You don't want to overdo the drift. You know, no one wants to go from 400 speed all the way down to 2, exiting a drift. You know, that doesn't sound very fun. But exiting drifts with more speed is a great skill check as well. So it lets good players get down to that lower gear and then still have more speed than other players. So it's really good for skill expression as well. It also makes the track more difficult without seeming unfair. So it's probably better than just placing a bunch of poles everywhere. Just make sure the drift is still well calculated and it'll be fine. So slowing down is more difficult to map, but it can be done well. So if you are gearing down, just make sure that when you go into that lower gear, you're staying there for a while. There's an actual purpose for you going into that lower gear in the first place. Try to stay away from defaulting to penalty surfaces and anti-turbos, as they mainly just don't feel good and are just kind of underwhelming. Like you drive over them, you're just like, oh, well, okay. The engine off block and uphills reward initial speed, while drifts reward maintaining speed. And combinations of these elements are good. You can use them to very good effect. And I would keep gearing down to a minimum. This will definitely not go in every track, but if you do want to use it, just don't have several of them. Keep it to 1, maybe 2. So we've talked about gaining gears, we've talked about losing gears, but what if you like the gear where you're at? And entire maps are dedicated to the idea of maintaining your gear. I personally call these maps keep your gear maps, because once you reach that desired gear that the mapper wants you to get, the map is then built around these tricky elements that are going to force you to lose speed. But if you drive them well, you'll keep that gear and you won't gear down. And even if the entire map isn't dedicated to this idea, I'd say probably most maps at least employ some elements of this. And it's a good way to help add those skill checks into these maps to let those good players really show how good at the game they are. Just make sure that when you are doing this, you test multiple lines, as I know the main focus is going to be on not losing your gear, but it can also be just as bad or maybe even worse if you accidentally gear up and then immediately lose that gear. So make sure you test quite a few different lines when you're looking to maintain a gear, just to make sure that there aren't really any sneaky ways around what you're trying to do. And as far as making it an obstacle, try not to make gearing up a bad thing, as gearing up means that you have more speed, and if you have more speed, that can be seen as good driving. And a track tends to be a lot more fun when it's focused on rewarding good driving, not punishing it. So try to keep the focus on not gearing down. The first of 2 ways that I've seen people use, myself included, to keep speed in check are just turns. And you have several map styles that are dedicated to this. And in these turns, if you're on road or platform, you'll probably have to initiate a drift, hold brake, which is going to slow the car down. And if you're on a more slippery surface, like grass or dirt, then you're going to have to slide, which also prevents the car from gaining speed. And the tricky thing about these turns is they're going to want to slow you down, but if you can do them well, there's going to be a balance where you can keep as much speed as possible going through these turns. And these are really good elements for letting players build up leads. And building different types of turns on different surfaces also makes the map pretty easy to tweak how difficult you want it to be. Just keep in mind what difficulty you want the map to kind of be around, and then as you playtest the map, as you build it, you're going to be getting better at the map. So don't just keep making it harder and harder because now you can do the map consistently. It might be a little tricky to keep that in mind, but try it. But I mean, there's a reason why turns are probably the most common speed control element. It's because they work really well. As turns are good for building up a lead, these next few blocks are good for rewarding players with that extra speed, and that is the engine off block, cruise control, and uphills. So engine off makes its second appearance, and it can also be used to keep your current gear. I'd recommend not combining engine off with uphills if you want the same gear as what you entered the section with. But other than that, the things I've said before apply to the same thing here. I mean, the engine is turned off. You're losing a bit of speed, but most importantly, you aren't gaining speed, so you aren't going to be going up into that upper gear. But if you don't want players to lose speed during a section, then cruise control literally keeps the car at the speed it entered. The car can slow down, but it can't go faster. But that's literally what cruise control is built for, is to keep the car at the speed that the car entered the section with. And uphills don't have to be so steep that you're losing speed. It is possible to have an uphill where you're just kind of cruising, similar to the cruise control block. But if you want to let the players have a little bit more control, then uphills are also a really good option for preventing the car from gaining speed. And if you really want to reward higher speed, then both the engine off and uphill blocks can punish slower players with the gear down. So if they enter with that lower speed, then they're going to come out of that section possibly with a lower gear. So even further rewarding players who enter the section with more speed, which cruise control is really good at rewarding those players. Can lead to some feel bad situations, so don't abuse these blocks, but they are really good options. But as far as maintaining gears go, any one of these styles is really good for adding that difficulty, those skill checks to a track, letting the better players express their skill and show just how far they can push a map to its limits. Just make sure when you're testing your map, you test multiple lines to make sure that the gears are where you want them. As the main thing you really want to avoid is when the car is fast enough to gear up, but then a second later they enter an element and it immediately gears back down, since that can be viewed as punishing good driving, which, I mean, that's just not fun. And turns are really good for building leads, whereas the engine off, cruise control, and uphill blocks are good for extending leads. And those are the three main types of speed controls, as well as an overview on gears. Just remember that these aren't hard rules. These are more tips. There's always going to be exceptions. And there's a bunch more ways that I didn't cover in this video. These are just kind of the general, if you're just starting, then you can choose one of these options that I listed and it'll probably work. But once you understand why these tips are there, why these elements work as well as they do, then that's a really good jumping off point for coming up with your own elements, your own rules, you know, kind of pushing the boundaries of what a fun, acceptable map can be. And I know when I'm building a map, it's kind of easy to just place turbos, or, oh, I don't want them to gear up, I'll just place a turn or something. You just kind of go on autopilot. But if you can purposely decide what type of element you want to have and what advantages and disadvantages it brings to a map, then that's really good for not only making the mapping itself maybe a bit easier, but it also helps just make the map smoother, you know, making those purposeful decisions. And I really hope that these tips helped you, because I know in the past, and even still, I struggle a lot with, maybe I want to build a map in gear 4, but I keep accidentally gearing up to gear 5, and with some trial and error, looking at what other people did, here are my speed control tips. If you feel like I got anything wrong, any more tips that you want to add, make sure to leave them down in the comments below. Or maybe if you would like some of my opinions on different mapping topics. I still have a lot of ideas for what kind of videos to make, but if you would like to see a video topic specifically, then that can help me maybe make it sooner if you want to see it. I'm sorry, but I got to get the YouTube stuff out of the way. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to join me on my mapping journey to hopefully become a decent Trackmania mapper, then go ahead and subscribe. If you want to, you can check out my club called the Struggle Bus. It holds a lot of the maps that I've built, including a little campaign of short 30-second tracks, some full-length tracks, as well as some maps that don't drive so well, if that's more your speed. But I really hope you guys got something out of this video. I don't really see a lot of mapping tips on YouTube, so trying to help out. I know I'm not an expert mapper myself, but hey, we're all learning, right? We're all trying to get better. So thank you for watching my video. I really do appreciate it. And to all my fellow mappers out there, I hope your maps turn out great. Bye.